All right. Banpick of the week, which is a British singer who is very interesting. Just some. She has some sort of Dolly Parton sort of background to her, so she's interesting to take a listen to. Her name's Yola Carter. Has anybody heard her? I should be listening to more music. But anyway, in fact, there was just an article, I think today on NPR about her. That is, she's a British singer, but was influenced by American sort of female country sounds. So you might want to take a listen to her. Also on Friday, I forgot to bring in the classic album of the week. So here it is. This is Beggar's Banquet by the Rolling Stones. This is a classic album. You've probably heard "Sympathy for the Devil" as one of the songs on here, or "Street Fighting Man." There's also a song called "Parachute Woman" that's really good. "Factory Girl" is another good song on this. But there's a picture here of the Beggar's Banquet with the Rolling Stones there. So anyway, you ought to get on Spotify and take a listen to the Rolling Stones as well. All right. So last time we were closing with Bastiat's The Law, and what he was making the point is that the law cannot be philanthropic, right? The law cannot be philanthropic. It just occurred to me. People that use PowerPoints, they don't have to write it twice, right? They have to write it again. So, being that I'm teaching the 10 o'clock class and then your class, I write the same thing twice, right? For you guys and for them. So, maybe one of these days I'm probably not going to do PowerPoint. So, but anyway. So what's his point? He says the law can't be philanthropic, right? That is, we talked about last time is the Tragedy of American Compassion, the book Tragedy of American Compassion. And what was that about? It was about how in the 19th century, certainly the last part of the 19th century, we had a lot of philanthropic societies. And then what happened was when the government started to move into this idea of that it was its responsibility to take care of the poor, the impoverished, or people who had a disaster, that led to less of us helping out the poor and more of the government doing it. Again, we've emphasized that the U.S. is still the most charitable places in the country or in the world. But nonetheless, what Bastiat is saying is that the government taking your stuff and giving it to somebody else doesn't make you philanthropic. It doesn't make the people that are receiving it feel like somebody has granted them charity. It's just really what Bastiat is saying. It's taking from some person and giving to another. And that's what he keeps saying. That's legalized plunder, right? So the only way that law can the law can help out somebody that's impoverished is to take from somebody else. If you want to have philanthropy, then you have to be able to say no. You have to be able to say, no, I don't want to give my stuff away. Hayek is going to say the same thing. He's going to call it altruism. Hayek is going to say that you can't be altruistic unless you're free to decide not to give your stuff away. And then what is one of the major problems that he talks about is that there's no limit, right? There's no limit if you consider government to be philanthropic. That is, just think about this, that if there were, there was 17,000 people's homes burned down in Paradise, California, right? If we say that the government's going to go in there and rebuild those houses, rebuild those, businesses, et cetera, if we're going to say that's the role of government to do that, then what happens if there's an electrical problem at my house in Hillsdale and it burns down? I mean, shouldn't the government take care of my house too? What happens if which did happen to me, right? I'm driving down M99 near the Walmart, and deer run out and crash into my car, okay, and cause all sorts of damage to my car. Well, that was that was some sort of natural occurrence, wasn't something that I could avoid. Shouldn't the government take care of that? Where does the government stop once you've decided that it can engage in this philanthropy, what Bastiat would call false philanthropy? Okay, there is no limit once government is engaging in this false philanthropy. There's no saying, oh, gee, at this point we're gonna, then shouldn't we take care of the people? You can always come up with some idea. We should take care of these folks, right? They're homeless. So what ought to happen is the government ought to take care of homeless people, okay? But what they don't have a car to get to work is one of the reasons that they're homeless. So shouldn't the government provide them with a car in order to be able to get to work so that they can earn enough money so they're not homeless? And maybe then they need to have, they're in a situation of, I was watching this on the news last night, what they call food deserts, right? So there's areas where people, there's no markets there that provide healthy foods, okay? So should the government then hand out oranges to everybody that lives in this area, okay? So notice how much this looks like when Mises was talking about this sort of, once the government, it's sort of a little bit different but it's about government keeping you from doing things, right? That is when he talked about, should government prohibit the consumption of alcohol? And his answer is, here's the problem. The problem is if you do that, there's no limit to that. Where he says, so he keeps going on about, well, and he finally gets to the point, well, shouldn't the government tell you that you shouldn't read these articles, that you shouldn't be able to read these things because they're worse for you than, drinking alcohol. So similarly, so you've got Mises saying, if you allow government to tell you what you can and can't do of things that just harm you, there's no limit to that. Bastiat saying, if the government's going to engage in legalized plunder, there's no limit to what your government can do. And of course, what does he think, right? A government ought to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. That's what a just government's supposed to do, right? It's the collective organization of our natural right to self-defense. Well, that will break down if you allow a government to do things which are simply taking from some people and giving to others, and you're going to call that charity. In fact, there's up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, there is a highway called the Dominic Jacobetti Highway. Anybody from the UP? Nobody's from the UP, eh? Why not? Okay. Yeah. How many have ever heard the Upers? Well, there you go. Eh? So you know what it sounds like when you're up there. Because I was on the board at Lake Superior State University, which is up in the UP, right at the Sioux. So we learned to talk this way. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to get understood by people. Anyway, there's a Dominic Jacobetti Highway up there. And why is it called? Because he was chairman of the House Appropriations Committee for decades and was able to get all sorts of state monies, state tax dollars to be spent up in the Upper Peninsula. So the idea, sort of the implication is Dominic Jacobetti was philanthropic because he was able to get all these cool things for the Upper Peninsula. And because that's where he lived. And so that is what Bastiat would say, that's false philanthropy. you have to be able to say no. Taking from your stuff and giving to other people, that, you know, if you take their stuff and give it to somebody else, you're not philanthropic. And I am not philanthropic, and then I'm just stealing your stuff and giving it away. I'm not being philanthropic. Then he talks about, it's interesting, he says that when he's talking about the courts, notice that he's really talking about that that the government does not engage in legalized plunder through the court system. And so he's looking at, you know, he's talking about how all this legalized plunder is going on, what he calls false philanthropy is going on. But he says, I mean, here's a direct quote. He says, have the people ever been known to rise against the Court of Appeals in order to get higher wages, free credit, tools of production, or favorable tariffs, or government-created jobs, right? So he's saying, wow, I'm looking at all this legalized plunder going on, but at least the courts aren't being used to do that. Well, things have changed. Today, the courts are being used to do that, right? Notice that Madison in the Federalist Papers said that the courts are the least likely branch of government to become coercive, okay? Now, people running for president in 2016, one of the things that people were talking about was that whoever won the presidency would be able to appoint at least 2 U.S. Supreme Court justices. So that was a political issue. Why should that be a political issue? It shouldn't be if all the courts can do is to see, here's what the law says, and say, okay, you came in here, here's what the law says, so here's what the ruling is. If the courts can go beyond that, if the courts can be used to engage in legalized plunder, that is to give your company an advantage over my company, or to take your stuff and give it to somebody else, if that's what the courts can do, then it's important who wins the presidential election. So what we're observing today is that what Bastiat was not seeing in 1850, we actually see today, right? It's not just the legislature and the executive branch that's used to engage in legalized plunder. The courts are used to engage in legalized plunder. In fact, why is it that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not retiring, right? She's, what, 83 or 85 years old. She's just had health problems, and she's back there on the Court of Appeals, or excuse me, the Supreme Court. Why is she there? Why isn't she retiring? Because she wants, when Oprah Winfrey wins in 2020, she wants Oprah to be able to appoint the Supreme Court justice. She doesn't want Donald Trump appointing the Supreme Court justice. So if she were to resign, right, if she were to retire, then why should we care if all the court can do is to determine what the clear language of the law is? If the court can't be used to engage in legalized plunder, it wouldn't matter too much. But the fact that the courts do what we call legislate from the bench, the fact that the courts can be used to engage in legalized plunder, that it matters politically who's going to win the presidential election, because they can appoint people to the courts. In fact, in Michigan, you had there was the use of the state Supreme Court was used oftentimes to engage in legalized plunder. And then in 1992 statewide election of the Supreme Court, Michigan's justices, that there was a majority on the Michigan State Supreme Court to say, no, you can only read the pure language of the law, called strict constructionists. And so there was a movement away from using the courts to engage in legalized plunder. That has now sort of switched back a little bit. Certainly at the federal level, that is something that again you wouldn't. I mean, actually what happened in Michigan was Bob Young was the state Supreme Court justice that was a Republican, and he retired. He retired early so that Kurt Wilder would be appointed as the Supreme Court justice, because in Michigan, even state Supreme Court justices are elected, but it turns out that if you have the name judge by it, it gives you a market advantage over people who don't have judge by it. So even though he wasn't going to be appointed and keep forever, which is what the case is at the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, it would still give him an advantage in the in the election. So again, we've gone beyond what Bastiat would even have thought about as where you can engage in legalized plunder, or the amount of legalized plunder. Then he closes, he says, the solution to the problems of human relationships are to be found in liberty. That is, how do you solve problems of human relationships? That is, some people are poor, and some people are attempting to invade other person's property rights. He says the solution to that, right, lies in individual liberty. That is, he says, the best way to solve any of these problems is for government not to engage in legalized plunder, for government to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property, because that's what government's there for, right? He says it's the collective organization of our natural right to self-defense. So the solution to problems, if you have poor people, the solution is for us to get together and to become charitable, to set up a homeless shelter. Our churches get together in Hillsdale and we set up a homeless shelter, etc. That's the solution to that problem. Not government to come in and say, oh, we need to take your stuff in order to make a homeless shelter for these people. Once the government can do that, then you've got no limit to what your government can do. So you'll engage in legalized plunder without limit. I put on in the Wolfram folder in the 105. It's a Politico article. It's called "Will Governments Reject Weaponizing the Court?" So that's what this article is about. Is that political parties might get together, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to use the court in order to engage in legalized plunder. So you might, if you're interested, take a look at that. All right. So that moves us on into Hayek. And what Hayek's book is about is it's about what sort of institutional structure of governance, what institutional structure of governance will maximize liberty. And of course, the title's going to give that to you, right? That Hayek writes about how you ought to have a written constitution. Now notice that Mises comes to the conclusion that government ought to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. That's because he wants to create wealth for the masses, right? And the only way to do that is market capitalism. And market capitalism works only if you guys get to decide what you want to produce, it's a system of voluntary exchange, how that's all going to work, okay? What is he comes to the conclusion then that government ought to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. But he doesn't talk about how can we structure government to maximize the probability that's going to happen, right? He talks about how we need to win the battle of ideas, how we need to explain things to other people, but he doesn't give you some sort of institutional structure of what the law might look like in order to accomplish that. The same thing with Bastiat, right? Bastiat says a just government does what its role is. It's the collective organization of our natural right to self-defense. And a just government only is limited to fulfilling that purpose, right? A just government is limited to protection of life, liberty, and property. But how do you do that? Is there some sort of structure of your government that gets you to that point, that is more likely to get you to a limited government? So what the Constitution of Liberty is about is, hey, let's think through these institutional ways that we may increase the probability that we have a government that's limited to protection of life, liberty, and property. So in the introduction, he starts out is that we need to clarify the basic principles of how we govern ourselves, right? That is, what are we trying to do here? That is, what is our beliefs, right? He says we need to clarify what are we trying to do and what are the principles by which we're going to govern ourselves. And he says you have to periodically restate them. He says in the introduction, he says it's a long time since anybody's done that. And he says, but you have to periodically restate it because people aren't just going to know it naturally. When you grow up and you're a kid, you're not going to automatically start thinking, oh yeah, well, things will work out better. We'll have more economic growth and we'll have more liberty if we structure our government this way, right? So he says we have to restate that. And so he writes the Constitution of Liberty in 1960. He writes Law, Legislation, and Liberty in 1973. What he's trying to do is to keep restating for people, here's how we ought to think about how we ought to govern ourselves. He says we need to be clear in our own minds what it is we want to preserve and what we believe, right? So what do we want to preserve and what do we believe, right? And we have to be clear in our own minds. If we don't, what we want to, what we believe and what we want to preserve. If we don't know it ourselves, then how can we explain it to other people, right? What are we trying to do, in this class? Why do I make it so that you have so many essay questions, right? I got over 70 of your essay questions or essay exams, right? So I got over 350 essay questions that I got a grade. Why do we do it that way, right? We do it that way because if all you do is recognize the right answer, then how can you explain to other people, here's why we, ought to have the law the way we do, here's why we should have a constitution, here's why any of these things, right? So with he says we need to clarify for ourselves what it is that we believe in and why we want to believe in it. He says, and so this is especially important. I mean, sort of think about it as you're making that transition from countries that how can I explain to people in Venezuela, hey, you guys, maybe you want to have toilet paper. Here's what you need to do in order to get there, right? If you, I don't know if you've been following it all, right? But Venezuela has all sorts of problems going on today, right? There is the person that's, well, first of all, people are starving to death, and there's a lack of health care, and people, 3 million Venezuelans have fled the country, and all sorts of going on, right? And so the existing government, what are they doing? They're blocking the roads that would allow relief packages to come in from the West. They're blocking the roads so they won't come in, right? Then there's this other person that is declared himself the interim president. And what's he going around? He's going around trying to get other countries to say, oh yeah, this is the real president, right? So the United States has recognized them as the as the interim president, and so as several European Union countries and some Latin American countries, etc. So there's a lot of chaos going on down there in Venezuela. And what Hayek is saying is that there's chaos going on because people haven't clarified for themselves what it is they believe in and how they're going to govern themselves. There's certainly not an agreement about how that's going to work. And how is that agreement going to come together? So it's going to come together if we are able to explain to other people, here's what will happen if your government is limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. Now, we're also going to read How the West Grew Rich. And what that is about is what Hayek calls the social evolution. That is, we went from feudalism to mercantilism to capitalism. And so that's what happened in the West. And we did this gradually over time. Hayek is going to say that if we had invented market capitalism, it would be one of the 7 wonders of the world. He talks about that in The Use of Knowledge of Society, that 1945 paper. How did we get here? We didn't just like wake up and it happened. We went through these various periods. And so what we're going to find when we read How the West Grew Rich is they're going to keep talking about how what happens here is a decentralization of the ability to make decisions. And that's what happened in the West. And notice that what happens in the West is that, we're where it grows rich. This whole point of that the West grows up, or West proceeds with liberty, right? Which is the ability to act according to your own plan. As opposed to coercion, which is just the opposite, right? You have to act according to someone else's plan. So why would we want to have liberty as opposed to coercion? If this were the feudal period, we're acting under a coercive society, right? The Lord tells us what to do. You don't get to decide, gee, I think I want to have Macintosh apples for lunch today, right? You don't get to decide that. You don't get to decide, here's what I want to, here's what labor I want to provide, or here's where I want to get my education. You don't have any of those things, right? So the feudal period, we have what Hayek's going to call the rule of man, as opposed to the rule of law. Well, what do we notice? We notice that in a society where you guys don't get to act according to your own plan, guess what? People live at about the same level for hundreds of years. If it's 900 AD, it looks a lot like 1100 AD. And 1100 AD looks a lot like 1300 AD. If you see the Bud Light commercial where they're moving the corn syrup around, well, they go to the Coors. I don't know if they go to the Coors Light or the Miller Lite one first, but they go to that castle, and they're pulling this corn syrup, on logs, moving around that way, clearly transporting it in an old-fashioned way to do it, right? You don't know. I mean, if you were looking at that commercial, you would say, "Oh yeah, that's 1257," right? They wouldn't be doing it that way if it were 1293, right? You don't know if that's 1257 or 1115 or 1304, right? Because it all looks the same. Monty Python's Holy Grail, right? Really good, documentary movie about the Middle Ages. And you know that it's 1263 because they tell you, right? But if you didn't know that, if they didn't tell you it's 1263, you wouldn't probably know when that was. Whereas if you look at a Seinfeld episode, what do you see? In a Seinfeld episode, you know that's not 2019 because they're not using cell phones, right? That you know it's not 1984 because they can walk around with the phone, right? It's still a landline, but they can walk around with the phone. So if it were a 30 or 40-year period, you can tell whether this thing what era this is set in. If I said to you, here's what's good, if I said to you in 1100 AD, what's the world going to look like 200 years from now? You're going to say, it's going to look a lot like it does today. Whereas I've said to you guys, what's the world going to look like 200 years ago? You're not going to say, oh, gee, I think they'll finally get to 6G, right? We'll have a 6G network 200 years from now, right? We're getting the 5G network soon, but in another couple hundred years, we'll have 6G, and who knows what that will do, right? No. You're going to think, wow, things are going to look a lot different 200 years from now because you guys are used to what? Innovation, right? You're used to things happening. Why are you used to innovation? Because you've been living in a market capitalist system where that produces innovation. But in a feudal period, you didn't have that. So if we look at it, why do we want individual liberty? One of the things that we're going to come to agreement on is that you want to have individual liberty for one of the reasons that Mises was talking about, right? It creates wealth for the masses. What Bastiat says is that you want it because of justice, right? A just government is going to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. What Hayek is going to say is that, eventually he's going to say, it makes the best use of the fact that information is decentralized, right? That was when you answered the question on the midterm, why can't socialism produce wealth for the masses? One of the reasons is because information is decentralized. It doesn't have a mechanism to make use of that decentralized information. But acting according to your own plan will do that. Again, Hayek's going to start out with what Bastiat was talking about is he's going to start out with the economic structure first. It's a matter of figuring out what the economic system looks like. So we're going to have economics, and that's going to lead us to what Bastiat would call a science of politics. And constitutional liberty is structured in a very similar fashion. The constitutional liberty, he says, what is it about? He says it's about a political philosophy. In fact, the exact quote is, I have it here. Oh, yeah. He says, it's a statement of a philosophy of men's living together, right? It's about social cooperation. What he's trying to develop with this book is what is the political philosophy by which we're going to govern ourselves, right? He says, right at this introduction, at the very beginning, he says, we need to establish, clarify in our minds, what's our belief and how we're going to organize ourselves, how we're going to, and we're going to develop this philosophy of this philosophy of political structure, of how we're going to organize our political structure. Then it's going to be based on social cooperation. Well, what does Mises talk about? Over and over again, when he's talking about capitalism, he says it's that system of social cooperation, right? He keeps emphasizing social cooperation, which is what Hayek is going to be talking about. So then he says, what do we need to discuss? It says the first thing is, why do we want liberty? Excuse me. He doesn't say, he says we have to establish why you want it, right? You guys might just assume that we should all have liberty. Okay, that's the, there's the Liberty Bell and all that other stuff. Okay, but why would you want liberty? If this were 950 AD, you're probably not going to be running around going, hey, this is why we should have liberty, right? You're not even thinking that. But if we're looking at what Hayek's saying is that, okay, if we're going to have liberty, we need to be able to clarify why we want it in the first place, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about. Then he says, what are the institutions? What are the institutions that will provide the most liberty, or most be able to provide liberty? Mises says that we want to have liberty. We want to have a government that's limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property because it's going to result in wealth for the masses. But it doesn't tell you, hey, if we structure our government this way, we're more likely to get there than if we structure our government this other way, right? He's got this whole discussion about how you should be able to win the battle of ideas. You should be able to explain to people how market capitalism can create wealth for the masses, and the only way that market capitalism is going to work, if we read through the foundations of liberalism, is for us to have individual liberty. But he doesn't say, okay, and here's how we're most likely to accomplish that. If we structure the law this way, or what sort of institution does that? The same thing with Bastiat, right? Bastiat says we ought to have a government limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property because it's our natural right to self-defense. Government's the collective organization of our natural right to self-defense. And a just government fulfills what its purpose is, and we'd like to have a just government. But he doesn't say, okay, if we structure the government this way, we're more likely to get there. Now, Mises does talk about democracy, right? But why does he talk about democracy? He says because it's more likely to lead to social cooperation, right? That is, why do we have democracy? It's not because democracy is more likely to protect our liberty, but if we know that if you can throw out your government, if it's not doing what you want it to do, then you're less likely to have revolution. It's a less costly way of doing it. So what Hayek's trying to do is to lay out here, what are these institutions? And of course, the title of it gives us the answer, right? And Hayek believes we ought to have a written constitution, and it ought to have certain characteristics. And when we get to chapter 12, we'll look at that. And then the third part of the book is applications of what he's developed. Applications of these ideas. Now, we are going to not cover that. We're going to leave that part up to you. There's very interesting chapters there. Read it on your own. We're not going to have time to cover it. This part will be up through, it's chapters 1 through 12. As again, when you look at the syllabus outlines that's what we're going to be covering in Constitution of Liberty. So the first 12 chapters get us to the Constitution, develops what are these general principles by which we're going to govern ourselves, what characteristics might the law look like. For example, if laws should be known. If the law is unknown, then it's more easy for government to restrict our liberty. If people don't know what the law is, then how can they behave according to their own plan? So one of the things we'll talk about is what are these characteristics of a good law. But at the end, he's going to say one of the institutional framework is to have a written constitution. Then he says that at the close of this introduction, he says, this book is really a statement of a philosophy of men's living together, right? So it's a philosophy, just as Hayek or Mises kept saying that liberalism is a political philosophy. It's not a political party. So what is this whole thing about? If we sort of think that a philosophy of men living together, then what is that talking about? That's talking about this idea of social cooperation, right? It's saying that it's a political philosophy that allows us to engage in social cooperation. Again, what did Bastiat say? We've got to have a science of economics before we can develop a science of politics logically. We're going to develop this idea of, okay, people living together, how's that going to work out, and where do you need government to come in? What does Bastiat say? We got to know if the laws, if people are going to act in a fashion that's antagonistic or not. If we end up with people acting according to their own plan, being all sorts of antagonistic results, then you need more government than if when we act according to our own plan, things are gonna work out well. So that leads us into chapter 1. Right? And chapter 1 is where he begins to talk about the basics of liberty. And in chapter 1, he says that this is where he defines liberty, right? He says that, we've already done this here a moment ago, but he says liberty is what? It's the ability to act according to your own plan. But he also says that it is not how many courses of action are open to you. It's not how many courses of action that are open to you. Notice again how much this sounds like Bastiat and his letter to Louis Blanc, right? That is, we might say that I have more courses of action open to me because I'm wealthier than you are. That doesn't mean that I'm more free than you are, right? It doesn't mean that I have more liberty than you are. Hayek emphasizes that given what your circumstance is, can you act according to your own plan? Given what your circumstances are, if you can act according to your own plan, then you have liberty, then you're free. Right? I might be really wealthy and not be able to act according to my own plan. If you watch Victoria, my wife's favorite shows is Victoria. What happens is she's queen early on when she's young, and she doesn't get to act according to her own plan, right? People tell her what to do. So over time, she starts to get to where she can act according to her own plan. But nonetheless, when she's young, she's less free than somebody that has much less wealth, but can act according to their own plan. So coercion says you have to act according to someone else's plan. If you're having to act according to someone else's plan, then you're not free. If you are driving, and we're going to, Hayek will spend a whole chapter on responsibility about, the chapter on responsibilities about when you should be able to act according to your own plan and when might you be coerced. But if you are, let's say you're learning to drive, and your parents tell you, well, you can't have any of your friends riding with you while you're driving because I think you'll get distracted, okay, then you're being coerced, right? You're having to act according to your parents' plan, not according to your own plan. And there may be instances where we want you to, it's better for you to be coerced because, and that would be an instance where you're not really capable of taking responsibility for your actions. So children don't oftentimes get clearly to act according to their own plan, right? They have to act according to your plan. Now, you might let them act according to their own plan over some range of actions, but you don't generally allow 5-year-olds just to go around and do whatever they want. In fact, I just got back from Indianapolis where we have 2 granddaughters. One's about to turn 5 and one's about to turn 2. They don't get to act according to their own plan. Now, they sort of think that they should be able to, and they will discuss this with you, and sometimes by crying or something else. But, you don't say, oh, you can act according to your own plan. Why not? Because they're not capable of taking on the responsibility of their own actions. And when we read the chapter on responsibility, we'll spend some more time on that. But again, you are free. You don't have more liberty than I do because you have more courses of action open to you. Given what your circumstances are, this is that. Then, if you can act according to your own plan, given those circumstances, then you have liberty. If you were to say people who have more courses of action are more free than others, then if you want to ensure freedom, then you have to redistribute, right? You have to that's what Bastiat was saying. And Hayek's going to say the same thing. The confusion that Bastiat said Louis Blanc's got, Hayek is later on going to talk more about on our commons, but making that same point. If it's the ability to act according to your own plan that's important. And why does that work? Because individual liberty is going to lead towards economic growth. It's going to lead towards what Hayek is going to talk about, the fact that information is decentralized. And the best way to make use of that is to have you guys act according to your own plan, because you're going to know more about your circumstance than anybody else does. All right, so for Wednesday, I'd say there's about 75% chance that I will have all the exams graded to turn back on Wednesday. So I think there's a high probability that will happen. We will then go through the rest of this chapter 1. Okay, so you should have read the introduction and the first chapter of Constitution of Liberty.